All right, guys, today I got a special guest, Park Ranger Andy Solgere. He is going to share a little bit about Major Robert Anderson, a fellow Kentuckian, and why you should make your way down to the greater Charleston area.
And I want to tell you about my dad who went to Xavier and all my uncles that went to Flagey. We'll be talking. That's a great question. You know, as we know, Major Anderson was from the great state of Kentucky, which was kind of a border state at the time that the Civil War was really ramping up. There were a lot of concerns about whether states from the West were going to be slave states or free states, and Abraham Lincoln campaigned on the platform of states joining from the unincorporated Western Territories would be free, and that was terrifying to the plantation and slave owner class in the Deep South. So Lincoln's name did not appear on the ballot in 9 southern states. He got 0 electoral votes from the South. He only got 40% of the popular vote, but with 3 other candidates splitting the remainder of the vote, that was enough to give Lincoln the win. As soon as Lincoln won, the General-in-Chief of the United States Army, General Winfield Scott, old Fluff and Feathers, who was a hero of the Mexican War, 1846 to 48, had served with Anderson during that war. He thought, there's something that maybe I can do to calm the situation that was starting to simmer a little bit in South Carolina. And so he sent Major Anderson down here to take over the garrison in Charleston. Now, the entire United States Army at the time was just a shade over 15,000 soldiers. So the garrison in Charleston, numbering less than 90, was small by modern standards, but not too small when you consider most of the Army was not in the eastern part of the United States. They were out west, subduing the Native Americans out there. When Anderson was sent down here, he was very concerned. He had owned slaves in his past life, didn't own any currently. His wife was from a Georgia plantation family that currently owned slaves. And even though Anderson was sent down here to kind of calm the waters, as it were, as a former slave owner, he would be in touch with the emotions of the plantation and slave owners down here. One person is not going to make that much of a difference. The city of Charleston had over 15,000 people in it. It was very much the center of commerce in the southeastern United States. To go back to the Revolutionary War period, Charleston was the wealthiest city in the United States. 9 of the 10 wealthiest men during the Revolutionary War were Charleston rice, indigo planters and slave owners. When Major Anderson was here, he was very, very concerned that nothing would start on his watch. So just a week after South Carolina declared its independence, on the 26th of December of 1860, just after sunset, Major Anderson and his troops all moved across 2,000 yards of water from Fort Moultrie, which was their headquarters on a piece of land called Sullivan's Island, out to Fort Sumter in the middle of the harbor. And they carried with them enough food to last about 4 months. He figured that they would last until the middle of April of 1861. 2 significant things happened before the middle of April. The first is in February of 1861, 6 more states joined South Carolina and formed the Confederate States of America. And then on March 4th, Lincoln was inaugurated as the president. And during all this time, Major Anderson had some communications via mail, some communications via people visiting. But once the Confederate States of America was formed in February, 2 months after the U.S. Army moved out to Fort Sumter, he got no communication. His cell phone didn't work, he couldn't get an internet connection, he had no idea what was going on. And so he was very, very concerned that he and his troops might be the cause of kinetic activity, which is the modern way we say people shooting at one another. And Anderson was very concerned. He kept sending mail. What he didn't know is his mail went to the headquarters of General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, who was the Confederate commander here in downtown Charleston. And Beauregard and his staff read the letters, but they didn't forward them on to the Army up in Washington, D.C. When the Army in Washington, D.C. sent letters down to Major Anderson, they were intercepted in Beauregard's headquarters, and they didn't get to Anderson either. So everybody knew what was going on except for Anderson, and he was very concerned. And on about the 6th or 7th of April, Abraham Lincoln, after having been in the White House for about a month, decided he was going to send supplies down to Major Anderson. And Lincoln sent a letter down to the governor of South Carolina, a governor by the name of Frank Pickens, and said, "Hey, Governor Pickens, the warships are coming escorting supplies. Do not mess with them." As soon as that happened, a delegation was sent out to talk to Major Anderson, who was very, very concerned. Psychically, he was under immense pressure. He had been grievously wounded twice in the Mexican War, and now he's all alone. Command is very, very lonely under the best of circumstances, but now he's got 85, 86 men out in the middle of the harbor. They've been eating salt pork out of barrels for weeks, and as I said before, they didn't know what was going on. They could just watch Confederate boats go back and forth guarding the harbor. When this delegation got out there late on the night of the 11th of April, 1861, they found Major Anderson. They said, "Major Anderson, we need you to pack up and we need you to leave. We want you to evacuate the fort." And the word evacuate was used because it's not a surrender, it's just a leaving and going to another place. And Major Anderson, even though he was Kentuckian by birth, he felt very strongly that his oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, was more important than his personal emotional state. And so he told the delegation, "Gentlemen, you have your orders, I have mine. If we are not fated to meet again in this life, may the Lord grant that we meet again in the next." The delegation returned back over water to a fortification called Fort Johnson, which is about 1.33 miles away. And about an hour later, the first shot was fired from a Confederate mortar towards Fort Sumter. It was fused to explode in the air over Fort Sumter, and that let everybody know that the dance was on. Shooting raged for 34 hours, going both ways. Over 3,500 Confederate rounds were fired at Fort Sumter. We don't know how many U.S. Army rounds were fired back from their cannons, but it was probably less than 10% of that because they had few cannons and fewer men. They were surrounded by at least 3,000 Confederate soldiers. And in the afternoon of the 13th of April, 34 hours after the shooting began, a big building on Fort Sumter caught on fire. That building was over 300 feet long. It was 3 stories high, and that building housed, among other things, the powder magazines. And so Major Anderson had to pull his troops off the firing line to start fighting the fire. And another Confederate officer came over and said, "Hey, you quit firing. You're out of food. Confederate warships, U.S. warships that Abraham Lincoln sent down with supplies are anchored outside of Confederate cannon range. They can't come any closer, and your fort's on fire. Are you ready to evacuate now?" Major Anderson reluctantly agreed to evacuation. And he and his troops were loaded on those ferry boats, and they were sent back to New York, at which time Major Anderson started writing his account of what happened at the fort because he was very concerned that he was about to be court-martialed. That's a phrase for a military court hearing where he might be convicted for starting the Civil War. Unknown to him, the press in the North had been describing this whole situation in Charleston, and when he arrived, he was feted as a hero. And the largest demonstration in the history of the United States up to that point, over 100,000 citizens of New York met Major Anderson in Union Square to congratulate him on a job well done. That's a great question, and I would expand it a little bit to why should you come down to the greater Charleston area. You know, during the years of the international slave trade, over 12.5 million enslaved Africans were loaded onto slave ships off the coast of equatorial West Africa. 10 million survived the trip, 2.5 million thrown over the side somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Of the 10 million that survived the trip to South, Central, and North America, only about 500,000 enslaved people were brought to the continent of North America. Of that, more than 40%, more than 200,000, debarked here in Charleston Harbor. Charleston is the largest slave port of debarkation on the continent of North America. So that everything that Charleston was, is, or is to become is literally built on the backs of those enslaved laborers. The reason that South Carolina was the first state to secede from the United States after Lincoln's election was because South Carolina was the most densely populated slave state. At that time, 57% of the humans of the state of South Carolina, 400,000 out of 700,000, were enslaved. So of the 4 million enslaved people that lived in the United States, this was the epicenter, the most dense concentration of enslaved people. When the Civil War began here in April of 1861, it started a change that would be irreversible. And that was a change to our nation. The Civil War defined what type of nation we would be, and that's united. And it would also define the condition of the citizens of that nation, and that is free. 4 million enslaved people were freed as a direct result of the Civil War, the largest emancipation of enslaved people in the history of the planet to date. So if you want to learn about the United States, if you want to know what types of decisions people made 150 years ago that affect us today, then this is one of the places that you can do it. So come on down, I'll still be here.